Welcome back. So, what is wicked leadership? In this video, I'm going to explain my model of wicked leadership. I'm going to give you a metaphor which helps to further describe the model. Then we'll get into a bit of detailed explanation of exactly what constitutes wicked leadership. I'll give you a background on the research that informs this particular model, and then I'll give you a really good example from industry. There's something else that we need to talk about before we go much further, and that is the use of the word wicked, which I've been asked about previously. I'm using wicked in its slang sense, which comes out of basically either out of London or New York, I'm not sure which, where it's not a reference to evil. It actually means that's really good, it's really connected. You've actually got everything together, and what you're doing is absolutely wicked. So, my model of wicked leadership has got three parts to it. There's sorted, there's shared, and there's sustained. What do those things mean, broadly speaking? Sorted is the model that you will have heard me talk about previously in other videos that I've got. And I'll talk about that in just a moment, but that's basically the emphasis on how we go about solving wicked problems. Shared is how you actually get a team to deal with wicked problems. And sustained is how the leader of the organisation, the chief if you want, for want of a better expression, actually puts the business into a position that it means it can deal with wicked leadership once they actually exit or leave the organisation. How those three connect is interesting in and of itself. So once you've got things sorted, then you can begin to distribute responsibility for fixing wicked problems by sharing them. Once sharing is put together, once you've got a distributed leadership model for dealing with wicked problems, then responsibility for dealing with wicked problems is transferred from the chief to the team much more fully. Once we've got a shared approach to wicked leadership, it's actually a little bit easier for the chief to actually leave a legacy once they move on from the organisation. Here's a great metaphor. It's from the Bible, and it's about King Solomon. King Solomon, an ancient ruler, was dealing with a number of problems, but there was one in particular that was really difficult to deal with. It was a wicked problem. And that is, he had two women who were claiming that a child was theirs, and neither of them wanted to give ground. So they were both giving reasons why the child was theirs, both explaining where he came from, and so on and so forth. Solomon tried everything within his power, within his considerable wisdom, to actually resolve this, but the women weren't budging. So he came up with a radical solution, and that is, he said, look, if you cannot prove to me, and neither of you will cede ground, then I'm afraid I am actually going to have to physically divide the child between them. At this point, the child's true mother said, if that's what you want to do, Your Majesty, then I give the child to the other woman. Solomon realised at that point that indeed a true mother is the one who would give her child up rather than see them harmed, and the problem was solved. Great metaphor for wicked problem solving. Now let's look in a little bit more detail at an explanation of the model. Sorted, you've heard me talk about sorted before, but that's basically how we approach solving, or rather taming, wicked problems. Sorted, situation. Have a look at what's going on in the world. Have a better understanding of what's happening. Raise your situation awareness. Objective. What is it that you want to achieve in taming the wicked problem? What's the outcome that you're actually seeking? Make sure you get a reality check. Is that really what's going on? Is your situation really, as you appraise it, is that what is happening with that particular problem? Then there's the template. Sketch the solution, or sketch a set of solutions, somewhere between 5 and 7 potential solutions for a particular issue. And then what we do in execution is we pick the most promising and we put it into play. We actually act what we call having a bias reaction. We actually put it into play. From that point, after the first phases of execution, then we begin to develop. And that is, there are two things that we change. We develop our solution to the problem and see if we can tune it, make it better. But we also develop ourselves. We improve our problem-solving skills. So that's sorted. Shared. I've managed to contrive a mnemonic for that, or an acronym as it's called sometimes. And that is that it's still looking at the situation. You're still looking at the situation, but you're looking in the situation from the huddle, H, of a team. And what's more, responsibility has been allocated. In other words, someone is accountable for dealing with the problem. Reality still has to be dealt with, still has to acknowledge that it's there, and execution is still very much at the forefront of solving the particular problem, as is development. But in this case, development takes a slightly different angle in that what we're doing is we're developing through considered conversation, through careful conversation. We're developing through reflecting on some of the ways that we've approached managing the problem. So what this is about collaboration. It's about enacting leadership. But one of the most important elements is how we actually reflect. We become what is called reflective practitioners. Now for sustain, I haven't managed to come up with a clever acronym yet, but give me a little time and I'll probably manage to. But what sustained is about establishing values and a support network that goes with that. So the chief, the head of the organisation, and the team work out what the values are that they want to work to, and then they work out how they're going to support it. And what sustained is really about building trust amongst the team members. So that's another important element. And then within sustaining, how do we sustain? Well, we coach in particular, and we also mentor. What's the difference? Mentoring is when you give someone the benefit of your experience. Coaching is when you set them up a framework so they actually can work out a solution to the problem that they're facing themselves. So two very different approaches to a similar sort of idea. So who's informed my approach to wicked leadership? Well, there's a whole heap of work done around the positive psychology space. Martin Seligman, Dr. Susie Green is another person who's influenced me in terms of how I approach leadership. I think the person who's probably written more than anything else in this space just at the moment is Kim Cameron as well. So those are three particular influences that I would cite. Also, of course, there's the work of Herbert Simon, who first worked out what ill-structured problems were and went on to write extensively about organisation and leadership. Rittel and Weber were the people who came up with the idea, or rather the name for this class of problems, wicked problems. There's also David Snowden is another one who has influenced me with his work on what he calls Sinafin, which is actually a Welsh name, but he's the person who influenced my thinking around the fact that wicked problems are either complex or chaotic. So Snowden's made a major contribution to my thinking. Etienne Wenger's influenced my thinking around collaboration amongst teams in communities of practice. The other people who also influenced me are the organisational scholars who've looked at what they call the reflective professional, led particularly by Shine and also by Chris Argyris, who's talked about the way that we learn. So those are the major influences on this type of work that I've done. Now, a great story is a story from Australia around what I would call wicked leadership. And that's one of the founders of the software company Atlassian. Mike Cannon-Brookes is well known in the media in Australia, and he's shown some clear leadership in some quite difficult issues. Most famously, he has looked to use one of his investment vehicles to actually change the way that power is generated in Australia. Now, he's not been successful in some elements of that, but he has been outstandingly successful in others. Now, there's a wicked problem where somebody who's a public figure with an investment fund has actually driving dramatic change around a wicked problem. He also, within Atlassian itself, has created what's regarded as an outstanding employer in Australia. Now, they're going through some problems as I speak, because he's got to make some redundancies because there's been a downturn in their business. But nevertheless, he's handled it, I think, particularly well. And as someone else who's handled making redundancies, I can tell you it's a very, very difficult problem to deal with. Yes, of course, it's difficult for the people who are, for want of a better expression, the victim of the redundancy process. But it does require careful thought, careful consideration of how you actually manage that process. And it's quite a difficult process for any leader to take on, particularly someone who is by nature constructive, which I believe Cannon-Brookes is. He's also got a really interesting approach to allowing people to work wherever they wish to. So he's actually interested in output. Now, what we see at the other end of the scale from what I call wicked leadership is genuinely wicked, if you want, in the old-fashioned sense of the word wicked, which is toxic leadership, which is where we see people who are not as secure as people like Mike Cannon-Brookes, who will actually set out to ensure that they can command and control their staff. They will demand that they are in work. They have to see them. They can't be working if they can't see them. That's rather unfortunate because that's got nothing to do with outputs and everything to do with inputs. So there's an example, Atlassian, taking on major global wicked problems, but also local, smaller wicked problems within their organisation and outside their organisation. Now, if you'd like to learn a little bit more, there's a few links below the video. In particular, take a look at the Wicked Scorecard, which is a way of assessing exactly what your work-life environment's like, or click any of the links. There's a white paper there, and there will be a book out later this year. If you'd like to get in touch and let me know that you'd like a copy, please do.